Hi everyone. So I installed a Factory UTV skid plate on my 2018 Polaris RZ S4 900 last weekend. I learned a lot from that install that I want to pass along some tips and tricks that might help you save some time when you go to install your skid plate. Um, Whether you're installing it on a Polaris, a Kawasaki, CanAm, if it's a factory UTV skid plate, I think you'll probably get some good information out of this video, hopefully. So I didn't do a traditional video install. I took a lot of pictures and notes, and I'll pass along that information to you in this video. I will be out in Moab in 6 weeks to try out the skid plate and see how it performs. So hoping for good things. Anyways, hope you get some good information out of this, and let's get to it. Okay, before we get into the installation instructions, I'll talk about the tools and items I use for this install. You'll want to have a separate cordless impact driver and cordless drill. It makes the install go much quicker if you have both of these separated. I used a 10mm socket for all my A, D, E, and F location bolts, and then I had a 3/8 socket for all my B and C location bolts. I used a 13/64 titanium drill bit. I'll go into that more later on why I chose that. I used one tube of blue Loctite thread locker. I had a white window paint pen. You can also use a white Sharpie or even some sticky notes, and I'll go into that more later on why I used that and how it improved the install. I had an auto creeper to get under the rig, made it much easier to move around and do the install. I had a couple of auto ramps for the front side to lift it off the ground, give me a little bit more clearance. I used a scissor jack. You can also use a car jack or something similar to put under the rig, and it'll actually hold the skid plates in place and take some of the weight off of you. Much easier to install that way. I had a 3-ton floor jack to get the backside up off the ground, give me a little bit more clearance. And then I also used an LED work light. Okay, so let's move on to the parts and hardware that are included with your kit. My kit came with a full skid plate, which is made up of 4 separate pieces. You have your mid, your main, your front diff, and your rear skid to make up the entire skid plate. As you can see from this first picture of the factory UTV skid plate, it's actually under the stock skid plate. And in comparing the two, there's a lot of differences. First off, the coverage is much better on the factory UTV. You get a lot more protection that way. And probably the biggest thing I noticed is on the side, the lips on the side. On the OEM stock one, it actually slips under the plastic on your razor. But with the factory UTV, it actually goes underneath, and it's going to take a lot of that abuse when you're going over rocks and so forth. So I found that to be a big piece of the difference. It's a much more rigid UHMW plastic compound. I would say it's basically bulletproof and should be able to take anything you throw at it. So far I'm impressed with what I see. The next picture you can see is of the bolts and the countersunk washers. They are labeled in separate bags. Just a reminder, I would highly suggest you keep them in separate bags until you actually need them, because some of the bolts are different sizes, so you don't want to get those mixed up. What's not pictured here are the angle brackets, the D-clamps, and the cross member section, which is also included in the kit. You also get an installation guide for your model. You can also print this off from the Factory UTV website as well. I would say their instructions are decent, but not great in my opinion. I feel they left some info out that could have helped me a bit more. So I'll go over that in the video as well, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you. So let's talk about what I did before I started the actual installation. I put the razor up on the front tires of the razor up on some auto ramps. I also jacked up the backside of my floor jack. That gave me about 23 inches of clearance. A lot easier to move around underneath the razor and get things done. You also notice I put some wheel chocks behind the back tires just for safety. I threw my work light under the rig, gives you a little bit better light to see what's going on under there when you're working. And then I put all my bolts, my washers, and my Loctite in my creeper. I had some storage compartments that I could put those in. You can see from this picture, it actually helped considerably because I had everything within arm's reach. I didn't have to dig around or move out from underneath the rig. I had everything right there for that step. So it proved to be very helpful to have all that within arm's reach. I also put my scissor jack under the rig with about 2 to 3 inches of space between the top of the scissor jack and the bottom of the rig, so that I could slide the skid plate on top of it and keep it on there and rest it on there. Okay, so let's get started. First thing you can do is get under your razor and use a 10mm socket to remove all of your stock bolts and countersunk washers from your OEM skid plate and take it off completely. You can see what it looks like here after I have it removed. Most of the bolts have a washer except two that I found. You will reuse all of your stock bolts and your washers, so hang on to them. Alright, so step one. This is for the chassis frame mounts. You're going to install your angle brackets in the 4 locations it shows on the instructions. Pretty self-explanatory when you get under there. Reuse a stock bolt with no washer. You can see from these pics what they look like after being installed. Next, you'll install your cross member section. This is one area they need to improve with their instructions, as it says to use a stock bolt in the center location. However, there are 2 holes in the center. I figured it out after a little trial and error. As you can see from this pic, the bolt goes in the hole that is on the opposite side of the J-clips. The J-clips will be pointed towards the front of your rig, and the center bolt will be closer to the rear of the rig once it's installed. After you have the center bolt in, just tighten it about 50% or so. You want a little bit of wiggle room there. And then use a couple of the D-clamps and 20mm bolts to secure the sides of the cross member. And you just slip the D-clamps over the round tubing of the frame and use a couple of 20mm bolts there from the bottom to secure it. You do not use countersunk washers here, just the bolts only. After you get the D-clamps and the bolts in, then you can use your 10mm socket to tighten everything down nice and tight. You can see from this picture how the D-clamps will look after they're being installed. Alright, so let's move on to step 2. This is for your mid and your main skid plate. You start with your mid skid plate, which is the one that's almost square. Put it up on a table or a tailgate of your truck and label the holes from the bottom. This is where you'll use that white window paint or a white Sharpie. So on the mid skid plate, there's A, E, and B locations. You're going to thank me later for this step. I found this very helpful because when you're laying on your back under your rig, you don't have much room between yourself and the skid. All the holes start to look the same. So this will help you keep them all straight when you're under your rig. The window paint will come right off with a paper towel, super easy. And no matter what, nobody's looking under your rig anyway, so no big deal. This is where I use my scissor jack also. I put it under my rig with about 2 to 3 inch gap so I could rest the skid plate on it while I was installing from underneath. After you put the skid on top of the jack, then you can tighten the jack down a bit so that it presses the skid closer to the bottom of your rig. So just a reminder that you will use a countersunk washer for any of the A, B, C, D, E, and F locations on the bottom of your skid plate. Now you start with the A locations first. There are 5 of them on the mid skid plate in the middle and rear of the skid. The instructions say to use 8 stock bolts and washers. However, there are only 5 locations on the mid skid plate. The other 3 you'll find on the main skid, so that's where the 8 comes from. I highly suggest you only tighten these bolts down about 50%. You want them kind of loose so there's some wiggle room later to align everything. And then do the same thing now for the main skid plate. Label all your holes with white window paint, put it on top of the jack, and get under there to put the stock bolts and washers in the 3 remaining A locations, which are right down the middle of the skid plate. Remember to only tighten these down about 50% to allow for some wiggle room later. For the next step, for the next part of step 2, it tells you to install the 4 D clamps at the front of the main skid. However, this is one part of their instructions I disagree with and changed the order up a bit, as you can see from the red arrows here. The D clamps have a little more tolerance with the hole locations since you can move the clamps around to align with the skid, the openings in the skid. You have very little tolerance, however, with any of the A and E locations of the skid, as they're already pre-drilled holes in the bottom of your rig. So for this reason, I highly suggest that you put your 20mm bolts and your washers in all of the E locations of the mid and main skid plate first before installing the D clamps at the front of the main skid. Once again, you'll thank me for this later because I learned the hard way. I tightened everything down. I also started up front. At the end of the day, I think this is the best way to go. Get those A and E bolts in first, and then you can go to the front of the skid and do the D clamps. Once again, only tighten down your E locations about 50% because you want to have a little bit of wiggle room later. They mention this briefly in the instructions. However, you want the seam of the mid and the main skid plate to be as close together as possible. You can see from this picture that I had a large gap originally. It was about a half an inch or so with the seam. You don't want this gap there, especially when you're going over things like sharp rocks and tree branches with your rig. It could cause some damage. Now you can move your mid and main skid around a little bit with that wiggle room and tighten up that seam. This is why I recommend not tighten down all the bolts initially. It gives you a little bit of wiggle room to play with and get that seam nice and tight. At this point, you start tightening down all of your A and E location bolts to keep that seam tight and secure the skid to the bottom of your rig. Okay, after this is done, then I recommend installing the 4 D-clamps on the front of the main skid plate. I found that the 2 D-clamps on the furthest outside of the skid, so the farthest left and right, were the hardest to install, as there isn't much room with your hand to get on top of the skid and hold that D-clamp in place while you use your impact driver to tighten the bolts. You may want to use like a screwdriver or some type of wedge to put pressure on the D-clamp from the top while you're tightening the bolt from the bottom. As you can see from this picture, I also used a scissor jack to keep the skid pressed against the frame, which proved to help quite a bit, make it a little bit easier. Alright, so now you can move on to step 3, which is our rear skid plate. The rear skid plate is much easier to install as it's smaller with less bolt locations, so this step actually went pretty quick. Start by putting your 30mm flange bolts in your F locations with the 10mm socket. Next, you'll start with drilling of the holes. This was my least favorite part, as my arm was like jello after drilling all these holes. I believe there's like 23 holes total you have to drill out for the whole skid plate, so just pace yourself there. This is one important thing that I did learn and highly recommend when you're drilling out your holes. They recommend on the instructions that you use a 1/4 inch 20 tap bit. However, I did that on these first 2 holes that I drilled out, and the bolts didn't tighten down quite as tight as I would like to. So for all the other holes I drilled, I used a 13/64 titanium drill bit to go through the metal. If you use a standard bit for metal, then it'll be fine, but it's going to take longer to go through the metal. The titanium bit made it much easier and quicker to drill out all the holes, and you're much less likely to break that bit as well. You can also use a scissor jack here to keep the skid plate nice and tight up against the bottom of the rig while you're drilling. At this point, just line up your drill bit in the middle of the B location and drill it out until your bit goes through the frame. Do this for all 3 of your B locations. At this point, you'll want to switch to the 3/8 inch socket on your impact driver for all the remaining bolts you need to tighten down. Use the self-tapping bolts they provided in the bag and tighten all of the bolts down. You'll need a little bit more pressure here since these are self-tapping bolts. After you get those 3 in, then you can move on to the next step, which is step 4. This is your front diff skid plate. You'll need to drill out all 4 C locations here using the same exact procedure from the previous step. Start with the 2 locations closest to the main skid plate and make sure that the seam is nice and tight. Then you'll tighten those bolts down, drill out the other 2 C locations, and then tighten those bolts down. At this point, you can move on to step 5, which is your side mounts and your last step. So as I mentioned, this is your final step for installing your skid plate and requires more drilling. You'll drill out 16 B locations with your 13/64 bit and use their self-tapping bolts and washers to secure the skid to the frame. As you can see from this picture, there will likely be a decent sized gap between the skid and the side frame. Since this project is so rigid, it's very tough to close that gap using one hand while trying to secure the self-tapping bolt into the new hole. Once again, I highly recommend using a scissor jack to tighten that skid right up against the frame. Once you do this, it makes it much easier to drill out the holes and insert the bolts. Start at the front of the rig and then move towards the back with each hole and self-tapping bolt. You should only have to move your scissor jack a few times on each side and then get it tightened up against the skid. Just a reminder that you will want to use a 3/8 socket for all of these self-tapping bolts. Once you've drilled out all of your side mount holes and installed the bolts with countersunk washers, you're done. Congrats. I can say this install took me about 4 to 5 hours working completely by myself and taking a couple breaks. Now that I've installed one of these skids, I could easily trim 1 to 2 hours off the install with what I learned from this first time. So I am excited to try out these new skids in Moab. I'm going to be going there in about 6 weeks. So I'm hoping to see a big difference in my confidence going over some of those bigger rock and ledge obstacles that are out there. So anyways, I hope you found this video helpful, and best of luck with your install. I'll see you later.